All right. Well, again, good afternoon, everybody. And we are at 1:30, so we are going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. Today's topic will be stormwater management, and we will be focusing on regulations and documentation. Before we officially get started, I wanted to touch on the webinar controls that you see on your screen. At this moment, all attendees are in listen-only mode, so you're all muted at this time. If you see towards the top right, there's a couple of buttons you can click. The first one is the questions pod. That's where you will type any questions or comments that you have. I'll be monitoring these questions and any comments that you make. So feel free to post those at any time that you want, and we will get to them as we move along. Um, and then on the finally, the materials button that you see right next to the questions pod. For this presentation, you have 4 handouts, and you can click those to download them at any time for future use. One of them is a copy of the presentation, and the others are documents that will be referred to during the presentation. My name is Tally Faulkner, and I will be handling the technical support for today's webinar. If you have any issues during the webinar, you can reach out to me in either the questions pod, I'll see them there, or you can also email me at the email address listed towards the middle left of your screen, which is arltap@uark.edu. Also, note that this is the first part of a 2-part series for stormwater management. This upcoming Tuesday, February 17th, we will be discussing best management practices. If you haven't signed up for it yet, feel free to go to our website, which is cttp.org/ARLTAP. You see that shortcut link on the right side of your screen, and you can register for the class from there. The instructor for today's webinar is Stacy Williams. Dr. Williams is the director of the Center for Training Transportation Professionals and is also on the faculty of the Civil Engineering Department at the University of Arkansas. This webinar is sponsored by the Arkansas LTAP program, and Patrick Thomas with RDOT is the program manager within RDOT. Today's webinar will generate 2 hours of Road Scholar credit through the Arkansas LTAP program, and you will receive a certificate, which will probably be mailed to you by the end of next week. Keep in mind that you must attend the full webinar to receive a certificate. Finally, if you have a group attending with you today, please let us know who is attending with you so that we can make sure all attendees receive a certificate. To do that, please send an email with your list to arltap@uark.edu, which again you see on the left side of the screen there. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Williams.
Hi, good afternoon. Good to see you all online with us today. I'm going to start out with a poll question, and I'm going to launch that now. You should see it on your screen. And that question is, what is your primary role in stormwater management? And the choices there would be, you might be an installer, an inspector, a designer, you might prepare documents, or maybe something else. All right, looks like we've got some inspectors and a large number of you have put other. I am going to go ahead, I'll give you just a couple more seconds and then I will close that poll. All right, so no designers or installers, but it does look like we've got several that are in the inspection business, and then of course the ones that have said other. So what we're going to be talking about today is kind of the general information about stormwater management, how that relates to construction. We are in general, working with roadways and that type of thing, and water is one of those things that gets in the way. It causes some damage, causes some issues, keeps us from getting some work done, but we also understand that water is important. So this kind of bridges the gap between a couple of different topics, but it's definitely a necessary part of what we do as representatives for a public agency. So in just thinking about our waterways, water is used for a number of things: recreation, agriculture, the energy sector, commerce. There are all types of reasons that water is important. Not all of those relate to roadway construction, obviously. And if you look at it from just a personal standpoint, we are very insistent that we have clean water. I don't want to drink water that's contaminated. And for the most part, I think a lot of us actually buy water bottles to make sure we have clean water, or we buy filters so that we can use filtered water and that type of thing. So as a culture, I think that we all feel like clean water is absolutely necessary to our day-to-day activities. Now, if we look at some of the situations in a different context, we might see some muddy streams, muddy water, and this might happen especially after a heavy rainfall event because we have some erosion and that type of thing, sediment. So in these two pictures, those don't really look like places that I would want to go and visit or hang out in very long. But we have a lot of places in Arkansas that are very nice. So one of the things I want to start out with that is kind of silly, but water runs downhill. We all know that. That's not new. Good news is you didn't pay for this webinar. So it is a free webinar, free information. But the important thing about this is that when we start looking at a lot of the other details of this class, it's all going to stem from the fact that water runs downhill. So if the water runs downhill, anything else that's in that water is also going to run downhill with it. So sediment, that's going to be traveling downhill as the water moves. If we have any fertilizers, pesticides, oils, heavy metals, bacteria, anything that's counterproductive that's in that water source, it's going to be traveling downhill. So all of those things are in motion and they're going to go other places. And usually those other places tend to cause some issues over time. The other thing we know is that water is extremely powerful. The more water you have and the steeper the slope that it's on, the faster it's going to move. So increasing the volume and increasing the velocity is going to give that water a lot more power. So think about Niagara Falls. It's a fantastic place to see. I recommend that everyone go there just to see that, but it really brings home how much power that water has. So when we have a heavy storm event, it makes sense. The picture on the right, you can see a layer of pavement has actually slid off of the roadway after an extreme weather event. You wouldn't think that would happen, but it absolutely can. So kind of amazing. But that's what we're up against when we're trying to maintain a roadway network, build new roads, and have these construction projects. That's the kind of thing that we have to be prepared for. Along with that, construction is widely known as one of the biggest reasons that we have erosion and sediment. We're one of the major actors in some of the sediment, which is considered a contaminant in our water sources. So if you look up stuff, I mean, way back, we're looking at 30, 35 years ago, this has been a thing. And we've made steps, taken steps and made progress in doing a better job. And that's really what this entire program is that we're going to be talking about today, is doing a better job of not being the bad guy, so to speak. But construction still kind of has that stigma. So lots and lots of lakes and reservoirs are affected by sources of sediment every year. And when you think about that water running downhill, maybe we've got a construction site that's at the top of a hill, and any erosion and sediment from that runs downhill, because we know that's where it goes, it's going to end up going into some type of water body. Maybe it goes in a roadside ditch, then to a stream, and that stream leads to a larger stream, which leads to a river, which leads to maybe a lake. But those larger water bodies can tend to take on all of this sediment. That's kind of that ultimate landing point for the sediment. And when we have too much of that in that water source, what happens if that water source is a public drinking water supply, or a number of things? But that sediment is going to continue to move downhill with the water, and it contaminates those larger bodies of water that we use for a lot of other things. That sediment can change the bottom, the shape of the bottom of that water body. It can silt it in, and we lose some capacity on the bottom, and it just changes the dynamics and hydrology overall. Now, erosion is kind of the culprit. This is where it all starts. And erosion is defined as the process by which the land surface is worn away by the action of water or wind. So this is where individual soil particles get knocked loose from their natural location. So things are kind of falling apart. There are a number of types of erosion. One of those is raindrop erosion, and that's erosion that stems from raindrops actively hitting the surface of the soil, kind of blasting those little soil particles apart. And so that loosens them or dislodges them. We might have sheet erosion, and this might be a situation where we've got a subgrade or a pad built, and then we get a lot of rain. We have kind of that layer of water that's just sitting, but water runs downhill. So even if it looks flat, like what's in the picture, water is going to find the lowest point. And when that water tends to move as a sheet all together, we get the friction between that and the soil particles, which also causes those particles to loosen. Now, if that plane is actually tilted or on a slope, then we've got a combination of things happening. We've got water moving, but it's going to be moving faster because we have a larger slope, which leads to greater velocity. The faster the water moves, the more damage it does. So on the left side, you see a picture of those little channels. They're very small, defined flow paths for where the water is going. And that's because parts of that slope are a little bit weaker than others. So the water will find the lowest point, the weakest point, and dislodge those particles first. And that becomes a channel, which then is even more downhill. So a particle of water running down the slope will also kind of fall into those crevices and create a larger volume of water in that exact location, which makes it worse and worse. As that gets worse, then we might have what we call gullies, and that's a bigger channel of concentrated flow. We might also see stream bank erosion, and this a lot of times is just naturally occurring. It happens, and in the picture it's pretty descriptive. You can see tree roots that are exposed. In the turn of a channel, typically water will move in whatever direction down the channel, and as it hits the outer edges of a turn in the channel, it's going to have some impact there. And when we have those heavier rain events, that water is moving faster and it scours the edges of that stream bank. So in this case, that has happened so much that the soil is pretty much gone, but the tree is still hanging in there. But that is something that's sort of related to what we're talking about today, not necessarily directly, but a lot of times we have roadways that are nearby a stream. And when we start to see the shape of that stream change over time, and that scour moves the edge of the stream toward a roadway, that can start to encroach on our roadway structure. And then wind erosion is one that maybe sometimes we don't think about as much. We think about water creating a lot of erosion, but especially out west, we have lots of times where it's maybe hot, dry, arid climate, but a lot of wind. And when those particles are able to be picked up and carried in suspension by the wind, then we've got soil particles that are dislodged from their natural location. Whole different kind of erosion there, but still we're losing some of that soil. Now, sedimentation is very much related to erosion, but this is the part of the process where those soil particles move. And so they're going to go somewhere, and it's easy for them to move because the erosion caused them to come loose. Now they're going to move, and they're going to move usually in the direction that the water is moving because they're carried in suspension, or even if it's in the wind, in the suspension with the wind. The lighter the particles, the longer they're going to travel. The heavier particles will go for a time, and then they will tend to settle out because they're heavier. They will sink to the bottom, and eventually there won't be enough motion to carry them any further. So sedimentation is kind of where they move and then where they settle. So we'll see deposits of sediment in different locations that are downhill from where that particle started out. Different soil types have an impact on how that actually happens. So sandy soils tend to have higher permeabilities. There are, in the grand scheme of things, sands, silts, and clays are the sizes of soil particles. The sands are the largest of the three. They tend to be fairly spherical in shape, so bigger rounded particles. Imagine a stack of marbles or ball bearings. There are spaces in between those, so we have relatively high permeability and can absorb a lot of water. So when it takes on that water, we have a little bit less runoff, and because those particles are heavier, those particles don't tend to go quite as far as some of the lighter ones. Now, silty soil, silts tend to have a similar shape to sand. There's still going to be those rounded particles, but they're smaller, so they pack together a little bit tighter. But since they're round, they don't grip together as well, and they're not heavy enough to hold themselves down, so they tend to be much more erodible. So even though they have a little bit reduced permeability, they are the small particles, and they will just take off when the water hits them hard enough. Now, clayey soils, clay is a little bit stickier. The runoff doesn't tend to pick up clay quite as easily as silt because clay particles are a different shape. They tend to sort of stick together because they have that additional plasticity, and they stack together more like plates. They're fairly cohesive and stable, but they can actually be more erodible sometimes when they're dry. They're those tiny dusty ones. Once you have clay particles, clay is 0.002 millimeters or less when you take an individual clay particle, so very, very tiny. That means they don't weigh much. When they're suspended, they can travel forever, it seems like, before they actually settle out. So if you have a clayey type of soil, don't be surprised if it takes a week or two for those particles to settle in water. And that's when water is not moving much. Imagine if it's moving a lot, it's really going to take these clay particles with it. Now, if we go back a bit in history, back to 1972, that was the time frame where the environment became very important, and important in the context of national legislation taking place to protect the quality of our environment. So you saw the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and so on. And the Clean Water Act was specifically to protect the health of U.S. waterways. And to do that, they developed a system called the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES. That is a program that's administered by the EPA specifically to provide for that national legislation. And the Clean Water Act essentially says, don't pollute the water. NPDES says, here's how we're going to make that happen. Each state, for almost every state in the union, also has a state level agency. In Arkansas, it is the Arkansas Department of Environmental Quality. It was ADEQ. Technically now it's the DEQ, but I think most folks still refer to it as ADEQ, so same thing. They are the ones who actually issue the stormwater permits. So at the state level, they have a lot more active oversight. The EPA has oversight of each state, and so on. In Arkansas, we have some laws that deal directly with the fact that we're not allowed to pollute waters. So one of those says that it shall be unlawful for a person to place or cause to be placed any industrial waste or other waste in a location where it is likely to cause pollution of any waters of this state. There's another one that says that it shall be unlawful for a person to purposely, knowingly, or recklessly cause pollution of the water in a manner not otherwise permitted by law. Overall, there is no manner that is permitted by law because it's illegal to pollute our water bodies. So, and then another part of that says that it's illegal or unlawful for a person to purposely or knowingly make any false statement, representation, or certification in any document required to be maintained. And today we're talking about regulations and documentation. There's a lot of documentation that goes along with stormwater permits, NPDES, and all of that. Now, if we don't follow the rules, we don't play by the book, and we violate those laws, then there are penalties that will have to be paid. So we have to have a permit to do soil disturbing type activities. If we rock on without getting the proper permits, or maybe we violate that permit in a serious way, it can be up to $16,000 for a violation. If that happens to also include an endangered species violation, that number goes up to $25,000 per violation. And that doesn't sound like the end of the world. It's definitely a lot of money, but consider that each additional day that that violation is active, it's considered to be a separate violation. So if you were penalized for a situation and it took you 2 weeks to get that resolved, that is a violation, $16,000 times every day that that violation still exists. That's going to add up very quickly. And then above all of that, the EPA can also assess civil penalties. As far as I know, they've not increased this at this time, but up to $187,500. That one's pretty significant. Now, part of the definition that we hear a lot is waters of the state. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means water, and it's pretty much any accumulation of water or any body of water. So it includes the things you would expect, like lakes, rivers, streams, ponds. It also includes wetlands, prairie potholes, wet meadows. It then also includes intermittent streams. That one's a little bit tricky because that means during a rainy season or a wet season, there would be a stream there, but in a dry season, you might not see any water, but it's still considered a water body because it's where the water would go if it were present. Drainage systems, if you have storm sewer in your area, that is considered a water body. We don't think about that. That's man-made and it's underground for the most part. We don't really see those indications, but it is a place that drainage water is collected, and our definition is all bodies or accumulations of water, so that counts. And then underground systems like wells, springs, irrigation systems, all of that is considered to be a water of the state. Doesn't matter if it's publicly owned, privately owned, surface, underground, natural, artificial, all accumulations of water. Technically, one person from ADEQ once said that even a puddle in the parking lot after a rainstorm is technically waters of the state. And here are just some pictures to show some of the types of water bodies that you might see. So you can tell some of those are natural, some of them are man-made. We see the bottom left one is just a normal looking stream, pretty area, but the picture at the bottom right doesn't actually have water in it. That's one of those intermittent streams that only during the wet times after a rainstorm would we actually see water there. And that happens a lot in Northwest Arkansas in particular. We have steeper topography. We have a lot more variety of elevations. So when we start thinking about water moving downhill, the steeper the slope, the faster it goes. So we have a heavy rainstorm and things move pretty quickly. They're going to flood quickly, they're going to clear quickly, whereas the south and east portion of Arkansas is much more flat. So there's a lot of area for the water to go, but if it floods, it takes forever for it to work its way out, or I guess sometimes it just has to evaporate. But it's a whole different dynamic in how we're going to deal with these because of the differences in the topography. But the more hilly areas you have, the more likelihood you have of those intermittent streams. Now, there are 3 categories that are not included in waters of the state definition. One of those is a sediment basin, and that is one of the best management practices that we'll talk about next time. And it's designed specifically to assist with erosion and sedimentation. So for all of this NPDES stuff, this is one of the ways that we're going to manage and keep our water clean. So obviously it's designed to include sediment, so we're not going to count that. And then also sewage lagoons, water treatment systems, those have their own set of rules. And then farm reservoirs are also considered exempt. In terms of authorities, we've mentioned ADEQ. We've talked about the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. That is the national level that oversees the state level agency. But we also might interact with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We might interact with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. We might interact with an MS4, that's a municipal separate storm sewer system. And a lot of the cities and towns in Arkansas will be part of an MS4. Then there's also a QLP, that's called a qualifying local program. And that is kind of like you have the EPA, then you have the state level agency. If you were to have a local level of that oversight, that would be a QLP. Hot Springs is the only one in the state of Arkansas right now. They obviously, their whole name is Hot Springs. They're all about water. They have a lot of tourism. It's very important for them to protect the quality of that water. And so essentially what's happening is that ADEQ says, hey, Hot Springs, you obviously see the importance of keeping your water clean. We're going to turn over all of this oversight to you. You will issue your own permits and do your own thing. You will kind of take care of anything for a smaller job site. For large job sites, ADEQ still has the authority, and then ADEQ will oversee that QLP and just make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do. But in reality, what happens is that QLP will oftentimes have more stringent requirements even than the state. And so ADEQ says that's good enough for us. As long as you're enforcing your rules, then we know that our rules will be met. All right, are there any questions?
Yes, we did have one question just come through, and I'll ask that in a second. And yes, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to post those in the questions pod, and we'll get to them as we move along here. The question that I have is, why are farm reservoirs not included in waters of the state?
That is a great question. It's actually one that I don't really have an answer for, other than the agriculture sector tends to kind of have some of their own rules. But it is a formal exclusion in the waters of the state.
Okay, well, I believe that is everything that we have at the moment.
All right, very good. Well, we will move on here and start talking about NPDES permits. The permit that we will talk about the most that applies to roadway construction and local agencies and such would be the NPDES Construction General Permit, and that is permit number ARR 150000. That is a permit. At one time, it was being renewed every 3 years. It is now a 5-year permit. It was last revised November 1st, 2021. That means the 5 years will be up in November of this year. And I think all of the documents for the upcoming permit are out for review or being finalized at this point. So hopefully we will have that information soon, and this class will kind of be overhauled to include the new information. But this permit is the state's primary way to implement pollutant limits and water quality standards. So our goals overall are to protect the water quality, number one. And then number two, satisfy the requirements of the Clean Water Act. So that national legislation has a whole NPDES system to help us know how are we going to protect the quality of the water. And then you get down to the permit, and it's going to deal more specifically with things that happen during construction and how we mitigate any of those issues during construction for this particular type of setting. So it will tell us, what are those requirements? Exactly what do I need to do? So that is what the permit is for. So it helps us know what to do permits are, kind of a, oh man, I got to get that permit. That's more stuff I have to do. But the good news is it does have enough detail in it that it doesn't leave it open for you to have to figure everything out on your own. So at least we do get quite a bit of guidance now. As time goes on, the permit becomes a little bit more, sometimes more strict, but also more specific, which is good and bad. But we'll focus on the good because it does tell us what we need to do. We are required to get this permit or operate under the permit for construction sites of 1 or more acres where soil is disturbed. So if you have a construction site and it's 1 or more acres and you're disturbing soil, then you have to have the permit. There are some exceptions to this, kind of, not really, I guess, but the question comes up in roadway construction context, what about an overlay project? Well, an overlay typically is not disturbing much soil. You might clean off some shoulders or something like that, but for the overlay project itself, you're really not disturbing the ground. You're putting a new layer of asphalt over asphalt that was already there. So we're not disturbing the ground. We're not changing the line and the grade of the road. Now, if that was going to be a different type of project, like a notch and widening, maybe we're going to add a lane to this roadway. It was a 2-lane, now we're going to make it a 4-lane, or we're going to add a center turn lane, or what have you. Then we will have to dig in, notch, and widen that out. That is a soil disturbing, ground disturbing activity that now becomes a project that would require the use of the permit. There are some maintenance activities. If you do chip seals, that's really not something that's going to require the permit. And then the question that comes up a lot with counties is gravel road maintenance. So if you have gravel or dirt roads and you blade those periodically, technically, do you call it disturbing the ground because you're scraping material there? This one's a little bit on the edge. But generally, if you're just blading and reshaping that roadway, it really is not changing the line and the grade of the road. So not altering, you don't have to worry about the permit. Now, having said that, if you blade off a lot of material and that material ends up in the ditch, and then we have a heavy rain and that material all runs down into a stream, lake, river, and so on, that still could be considered violating the law that says do not pollute the water bodies. So take this in context of you don't have to have the permit to do these things, but if there are unfortunate consequences there, then you still could get in trouble for that. So I would encourage you to use best practices for blading your gravel roads, pull the material in, keep it on the roadway. The biggest thing is if you're scraping material off the roadway and it goes in the ditch, that's material you probably paid for that's now wasted. It's gone. So from a financial standpoint, we don't want to do that anyway, but we do need to maintain a nice surface. So pull that material in, keep it compacted, keep as much as possible out of the ditches, and then also maybe pay attention to your weather forecast. Maybe don't blade when you know a big storm's coming in the next day or two. All right, so we know that if we disturb an acre or more, the permit is required. Aside from that, we also have 2 categories of project size, and that is either small or large. A small site is considered less than 5 acres. A large site is 5 or more acres. Now, big picture is that it doesn't matter what size. If it's 5, more than 5, less than 5, doesn't matter. We're going to do the same things on the ground that need to be done to prevent polluting those waterways. But there are some distinguishable points that paperwork is going to be different. So the things we do will be the same on the site. The paperwork that we have to prepare will be a little bit different. So in general, just think of it as we're going to treat everything as a large site. RDOT has that as one of their they actually state that every project is considered or treated as a large site. just paperwork is different. Keep in mind that things like clearing, grubbing, excavation, demolition, constructing a haul road, all of those things that sometimes are extraneous to the core area of the project itself, those are ground disturbing activities, and those are going to require the permit as long as it's an acre or more. So do you need a permit? If it's new construction and a large project, which means 5 or more acres, yes. If it is a small project, less than 5 acres, that's still going to be a yes if more than 1 acre, an acre or more is disturbed. If you are doing maintenance, grading your unpaved roads, you do not need a permit. If you're doing patching, overlays, chip seals, you do not need a permit. If you're widening, you do. If you are cleaning out ditches, you also need the permit because that is actively disturbing the ground and it's in a location that we expect water to accumulate. So technically, a ditch is a water body. So that would be operating, doing work, and disturbing the ground in a water body. So that's a kind of a picky difference, but that means we've got to be really careful for something that you might think of as just kind of everyday cleanup. We've got to have the permit to do that. Bridges and culverts. If I'm doing that type of construction and I'm in the immediate vicinity of a water body, then yes, we absolutely need the permit, but we're also going to need a lot of other things. We'll talk about those later. Once the STAA, short-term activity authorization, 404 permit, and so on. But all of these things, I'm telling you, here's the letter of the law. But in concept, it doesn't matter if you need the permit or not. We're still obligated to follow best practices and try to keep as much sediment out of our water bodies and the potential for sediment in water bodies to an absolute minimum. So even if you don't have to have the permit, you're not excused automatically from everything. All right, the permit process. How does this work? Well, ADEQ or DEQ has to know that you intend to do a project. So the first step is to submit what's called a notice of intent, the NOI. You will also prepare a stormwater pollution prevention plan, which I call a SWIP. I've heard it called a lot of things, SWIP, swoop, swope, SWIPy, SWP, SWPP, all that kind of thing. It's the same thing. It's the big document with all of the information. So we're going to complete an application online that says, hey, ADEQ, I've got this project. Here's what I want to do. That notice of intent tells them some of the information about that project. The SWIP tells them a whole lot about that project. And we have to submit those 2 items at least 2 weeks prior to the start of work. Now the NOI form there was a form that you could print off and then everything's gone digital. It's great. The e-portal is much faster, much simpler, and you get results a lot quicker. So that form, I don't have, a copy of anything in your handouts to show you what that is so much because it is all online. So you create an account, you submit your info, it goes through the channels. There is also a fee. Now, this is for kind of the large site, big construction project. Submit your SWIP, and ADEQ is going to review that SWIP document, all the details, and that SWIP is going to tell them, okay, what are you doing on the project? How will this impact the soil? How will this impact drainage, water, erosion, sediment? And when those things are happening, any ground disturbing activities are happening, how are you going to keep sediment from leaving the job site? How are you going to prevent those water bodies from being impacted or contaminated? So that description is all going to be a part of the SWIP, and they review that during that 2-week period before you start work. If they look at it and say, yep, this looks good, we agree this should work, they're going to send you back an approval letter. It is called a notice of coverage, the NOC. It's also sometimes called an authorization to discharge. And this is just your permission from ADEQ to operate under the permit. So you've got an approval, you've been permitted to do this work. Then you go through the entire project, you do all of the things, you finish, you put everything back, make sure that the site is stable, and the project is complete. At that point, you're going to submit what's called a notice of termination, which means all of your soil disturbing activities are finished and the site is stable. And if they want to come and do a final inspection, this is the time to do it. But all of our work here is done. Now, work in a water body. This is a little more sensitive because if you lose any sediment from your job site is already right there at a water body. So you have very few chances to catch it before it can contaminate that water. So anytime we're working in or in the immediate vicinity of a water body, this is going to be things like bridge or culvert construction. If you're putting in, culverts, box culverts, pipe culverts, if you're doing any channel alterations, even debris removal, trying to clean out a stream to maybe promote some of your drainage pathways. A lot of maintenance activities kind of fall in this category as well. Then you have to not only get permission from ADEQ, you also have to get a 404 permit. That comes from the Corps of Engineers. So that is referring to Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. And that is going to use a little bit different definition for your water bodies. It's instead of waters of the state, it's going to be waters of the United States. The overall definition tends to deal a little bit more with definitions of waters that are used for commerce, like things along the coast where you may have offshore fishing, any type of commerce that way. Arkansas doesn't deal with that because we obviously aren't on the coast, but still the language is going to kind of route us right back around to what we've already used for waters of the state. Now, when you need a Section 404 permit, you also are required to get a Section 401 water quality certification. You have to have this issued before your 404 permit is valid. So the steps are to go through ADEQ and get a water quality certification. That's your 401. After that, then your Corps of Engineers 404 permit can be valid. Additionally, there's also a short-term activity authorization that's required from ADEQ, and this is saying, I'm going to work in or very close to a water body. I'm going to get in and I'm going to get out. And you notice the term is short-term activity. They want this to be as short a time as possible. So let's say that you're going to build box culverts. And this is obviously in a water body. How quickly can you get in, do the work, and get back out? Well, there are different ways to look at your critical path scheduling, but we want you, in this context, to look at how can you get out of the way of the water body as fast as possible. The more we can limit the time of potential contamination, the less contamination we're going to have. So they want you to get this done within 6 months. Now, if you're building a bridge, can you build the entire bridge in 6 months? Maybe, maybe not. A lot of the larger ones, not so much. And then you don't know your construction schedule. Maybe you can plan it for 6 months, but if you have a lot of storms, you have weather delays and such, it could take longer than that. So these are renewable contracts, but they're really wanting you to think about your scheduling process, the stages of construction, and how this can possibly get done where you're only impacting that water body for a maximum of 6 months. So that's kind of what that's all about. And then also during that 6-month time frame, they're probably almost always now they're requiring some turbidity testing. So there are some testing requirements, and you have to submit those results periodically. So what is turbidity? Turbidity is kind of a fancy word for dirty water. So it's technically a measure of the clarity of water, and it can be measured by passing a beam of light through a sample of the water. So if you had, you can see in the picture here, there's a meter and there's that little glass jar with a water sample. Once that sample goes down into the machine, a beam of light is passed through it, and if that water is completely clear, all of the light passes through and can be detected on the other side. If you have dirty water, though, not all of that light will pass through, and so there's a reduced measurement on the other side. And that change gives you a numerical value for how dirty the water is. Well, it's that level of turbidity. So that turbidity meter is pretty cool. It kind of does it automatically. You put it in, push the button, and it gives you a number. And so then you report that. I will say that if you use one of these, make sure that your little glass sample containers, keep those clean. If you have smudgy fingerprints on the glass, that will read as turbidity because it's something blocking the light. So make sure that you keep that, the outside of that sample container, as clean as possible. Now, turbidity we don't like because that's an indication that we have sediment in the water. It's murky, it's ugly, it's not a good thing, but it's more than just dirty water. Those suspended solids that are caught up in the water not only affect clarity and color, but also increase the temperature of the water. When you increase the temperature, that will decrease the amount of dissolved oxygen that's available to the wildlife, the fish, and other species that have their habitat there in that water body. So sometimes you see a lot of increased disease in fish. Some of it is not that something poisonous went there. It's just that we've reduced their dissolved oxygen to a point that they're not able to survive. So it has some far-reaching impacts. And then, you know, everything in nature depends on something else. So it continues to make that chain reaction go along. All right, so let's back up and talk in a little bit more detail about before construction, submitting that notice of intent. The large sites are required to submit this NOI 2 weeks before beginning work. If it is a small site, you don't actually have to submit this, and that's because they're going to charge, it was $200, it may have gone up at this point, but the large sites do have to pay a fee. And then ADEQ reviews the documents. The big document is the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan. This is a complete plan for your project. Project info, plans, specs, drainage information, your site, your topo map, and then also what BMPs or best management practices you're going to put in place to help mitigate the effects of construction on sediment. And then this becomes a living document. It's not just something that you do before the project and then stick it on the shelf. You're going to be referring to this, you're going to be updating it, adding pages, and so on. And inspection reports will be a part of that. So where can you find information on how to do this? Well, if you go to the website for the state of Arkansas, it's adeq.state.ar.us. Down on the left-hand side, there is a button for water permits. When you click there, it will expand and scroll down to the NPDES permits, and there's a list of things there. One of those is the general stormwater permits, and there's one for construction stormwater. That's the one that we are talking about. On that page, there will be links for some of the forms that you need. There's a link to the permit, some fact sheets. They have most of their forms in PDF or Word form. And again, some of this I'm still showing, but it's actually to be submitted online. There's an inspection form, notice of termination, all kinds of stuff there. All right, this is what the old form looks like, but I wanted you to see the types of information that's asked for in that NOI, notice of intent. So a lot of it's just information. Who's the owner of the project? Who is applying for the permit? Contact information and such. What type of operator So the one asking for the permit is the operator. So if you are a local agency and you do all of your own work, this is you, you're doing the work, you're keeping up with all of this. But sometimes we hire contractors to do projects. So there's another level or layer of responsibility in there. So you might be a public agency, and then we're going to see later that the contractor doing the work will have to also agree to the items in this document and the SWIP. They, of course, want information for invoicing, and then it starts going into details about what's going to happen in the project. Project information will include a description of the project, the total area, and then separate from that, you want to know how much of that area will be disturbed. That's going to be in terms of acres. We need to find the receiving waters. So what that means is if sediment, say there's erosion and the sediment gets loose from my job site, where will it ultimately end up? And when it gets there, is it going to potentially impact a water body that's already sensitive? And we'll talk more about the TMDL and the 303D listed water bodies. Those are ones that already have some type of an issue. We've got to be extra careful around those. We want to know if there are any endangered species expected in that area. Do we have any wetlands? Are there any special topographical features? Are there flat spots or really steep areas? That's going to help guide us through the thinking process of how do we mitigate any of the issues for those specific situations. We need to know about the drainage area. If my project site is in a low area and I've got a lot of water running toward my project from higher elevations, that's going to impact how I treat things. We'll look at runoff coefficient after construction. Vegetated buffer zones, I've got to leave some space before I get to a water body. And then also utilities. Now, receiving waters. Well, I'm doing a project and I don't think there's a stream or a lake or anything anywhere close to it, so I don't have a receiving water. Well, there is always an ultimate receiving water. And on the website, there's a map you can pull up. And if you locate your project here on the map, let's say, I know City of Bentonville is watching with us. So if we're up here in section 3J, the northwest corner of the state, number 3 goes to the Arkansas River. So the Arkansas River comes in on the west side, runs down through central Arkansas. That means that if I have sediment that gets loose from my project, it's going to move and travel and go from point to point and follow the path of water all the way down to the Arkansas River. Now, if I'm more in the north central portion, all of these are number 4s. Number 4 is the White River. That means ultimately a problem in my project location has the potential to impact the White River. Okay. Down in South Arkansas, we've got the Washita River, and the 2s, the Red Rivers, and the 1s, St. Francis River, there's the 5s, and then 6 is going to be the Mississippi River. So there is always an ultimate receiving water. If you're not sure, look at the map. Now I mentioned the impaired waters, the 303D list. These are water bodies that already have some sort of an issue. And it may not be anything related to construction. Sometimes it is. It could be that they already have maybe a natural problem with sediment, or something else has happened that's created that problem. Sometimes it's a chemical. Maybe it's some sort of toxicity. Maybe the pH level is not good. It could be too many nitrates. Whatever that problem is, from whatever source it is, we know that there's already a problem there, which means I've got to check this list and see what the problem is, and then determine if my project is going to create more of that same kind of problem. If so, I've got to be super, super careful to not let that be a problem. The official listing tends to run several years behind. I think last time I updated this, the 2018 was official, the 2020 was still a draft, and that was just a few months ago. So slowly but surely those do get updated. I would look at the draft listings and get the most updated ones for there. But they do have maps by county. So on the overall state map, you can see there's little pink lines, little yellow lines, and that's all you can see in the legend what category of that type of impairment is. And so most of the things that we are concerned with as construction is we're looking for ones that are already impaired for turbidity, for sediment, and then possibly oil and grease. And those are the kind of things that we're going to see during construction. So if I know that my water body already has that particular problem, I'm probably going to make it worse with my project. There are other water bodies that have special protection, and there are several designations for that. One is ERW, that's Extraordinary Resource Water. Ecologically sensitive water bodies, natural and scenic rivers, public water supplies, cold water fisheries, and then impaired waters also fall on this list. Again, we need extra protection because there's something special about that water body. It might be that it's like the natural and scenic, the Buffalo River, high profile. It's a big deal when something goes wrong or there's a contaminant that's getting into that river. If it's a public water supply source, that one's kind of obvious. If you have a contaminant that gets in there and that has a big impact on the water treatment system that cleans it for the constituents of that water source, we got to be able to get it clean. If you put too much contaminant and can't get it clean, that will impact all the citizens of that area. The city of Clinton a number of years ago had to invest a lot of money to upgrade their water treatment system specifically for sediment that was in their water. They weren't able to keep up. So it has a huge impact on funding and improvement. So if we could just keep that sediment out of the water in the first place, that makes everything else much easier. Now, the other term that's on this slide is the TMDL, that's total maximum daily load. That refers to the fact that a water body might already have something, whether it's naturally occurring or is already there for whatever reason, plus the effects of construction. If your water body or your project is close to a water body that has a designated TMDL, that means that the total cannot exceed a certain amount. So that has to be established. ADEQ does that kind of thing. And if you have that situation, you're going to have to do some testing and you'll have to do some extra reporting to show that you're not exceeding that daily limit. Endangered species. This one is the hardest one of all in my mind, just because my background expertise is more in roadways and asphalt and construction, and I don't know much about endangered species. So part of this permit process is to certify that I've done my homework and don't see any issues with an endangered species. I don't really know that. So it's hard for me to feel confident in signing a piece of paper that says, hey, there are no endangered species on my project site. I don't really know that. There are rules for what you can and can't do within things like 860 feet of a bald eagle's nest. I don't know where those nests are. I don't know where the Ozark big-eared bat lives exactly. But the good news is there are people who do. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife has a lot of information on their website. And really what you're doing when you submit this part of the certification is that you're signing to say, I did the best I could to figure this out. I'm aware that if there is an issue, some things may have to change during construction, but I've done the very best that I can to show that there's not an issue with an endangered species. If you work for RDOT, RDOT has an environmental division that deals quite a bit with this, and they know these kinds of things, so that's great. Otherwise, I would say check the website. U.S. Fish and Wildlife can let you zoom in on endangered species, and they will have color-coded maps that show where you are most likely to encounter some of these certain species. So in the northwest corner of the state, the Ozark big-eared bat, give some information about that, and that would tell me that, hey, I might need to check in on this. Or if I was in central Arkansas, that part's not in green. I know I don't have to worry about that one. That's not likely to be an issue at all. So it at least gets you to a point that you can kind of narrow down some things. Another thing that we need to convey to ADEQ early in the process are any topographical features. So what I mean here is, where do I have steep slopes? The steeper the slope, the faster the water is going to run downhill. The faster it goes, the more damage it does. So ADEQ wants to know, where are the most likely spots around your project that could be impacted by something like that. So we can pull up a contour map, which is a map that shows lines of elevation. And many of you have probably seen something like this, but this is a little zoomed in section of a contour map. And you can see some of the numbers here. So let's zoom in a little more, and you'll see the lines. They all have a 1700, 1600. That is the actual elevation. And then the not so bold lines in between are in 20-foot increments. What we need to do is look at this two-dimensional piece of paper or screen and say, which way does water go? Well, I need to know the elevations. As the elevation goes down, that's the direction water is going to go. And the water will run downhill perpendicular to the contour lines. A contour line is a line of equal elevation. So if you were to walk along one of these lines, you would not go uphill or downhill. If you turned and veered off, you would go up or down. So these orange ones, if you find the 1500s and trace that line, the lines in orange are a 1500-foot elevation. And then the blue ones represent 1600, the purple is 1700, and the red is 1800. So as I go from orange to blue to purple to red, I'm traveling uphill. Flip that around. Where's water going? Red to purple to blue to orange. So now I can start looking at that, and if I know that water runs perpendicular to these lines at any given point, I can draw arrows that show which direction water is running. Now also notice, sometimes you'll have, hopefully you can see my cursor here, a little divot in that line, that little bump. That kind of shows a path where water will tend to concentrate. Up here in the 1500, that orange area right up at the top on the right, you also see a little blue line. It's a dash dot dot dot. That represents the path of a stream, and that makes sense. That follows what we would expect given the layout of those contour lines. So which way is that stream running? Is it running to the left or to the right? And well, everything is concentrating. It's moving toward the center, that lowest point, and then it is moving toward the left. Okay, so if we look at a topo map, now I suddenly have a really good idea of where the water is going to be, and I can put that in context of where my project site is and note, do I have water running onto my job site? Do I have water running off of my job site? Do I have areas of both? I can also use a map like this to determine drainage areas. So if you look at the section here that's shaded in the top and right portion of the slide, everything here, we're kind of do a line that might represent the highest elevations, and then everything else runs downhill. And you know the 1800s were the tallest. So down here in the middle right section, that's the highest point. And then we identified a stream. All of that is running toward the stream. Also from the top of the screen, that other side of the stream, water is running toward it. So we can start to get a big picture of where is water running and concentrating. That tells us a whole lot, and it also helps ADEQ a lot about how your project is going to coordinate with how these water flow patterns go. Now, additional drainage information will be things like runoff coefficient. Now, what does that mean? Runoff coefficient describes how much water runs off of a certain surface as compared to how much water soaks in to that surface. So let's say that we have pasture land. When it rains, assuming it's kind of a medium steady rain, a lot of that water is going to stay in place. There's vegetation, we've got root structures, and you can see the picture there, all the water droplets. That water is held in its location, and it's going to kind of soak in slowly. The picture on the right, though, is a paved parking lot. When water hits that area, it's going to run off. Not so much of it's going to soak in like it would in that pasture land. So when somebody like a Walmart or a Home Depot or large commercial development comes in and they clear that pasture and replace it with hard surface, we have a very different change in drainage patterns. We have a change in runoff coefficient. So rather than everything's soaking in, we now have a lot of water running off. And where is it going to go? How is it going to impact things downstream? So how does your project accommodate that type of design or that type of change? Right, vegetated buffer zones. We have to think about this. This refers to an area near an existing water body, and we are required for normal, typical water bodies that we cannot clear the ground for 25 feet out from that water body. So if you look at the diagram on the left, we've got our water body, we've got the roadway and the box culvert running through there. If I'm going to do construction here, I cannot clear the ground within 25 feet of the edge of that water body. Okay? Now, if that water body is impaired, or it's one of those special categories, or for whatever reason there's something special about it, now that goes up to 50 feet. So I can't do any clearing within 50 feet of that type of water body. Sometimes there will be a really special, super sensitive situation. The ADEQ director can change that from 50, I've heard as much as 125 feet, where you're not allowed to get in there and clear. Now, you're already thinking, if I'm building a box culvert and I can't get in that area and do any digging, how am I going to get it built? Well, you can do that work, but it has to be justified in your SWIP document. And that's pretty obvious. You can't build it if you can't get there. So that would be something where you have to have a good plan in place to keep sediment from getting into that water body as much as possible. So as long as you can justify it and show that you've thought through that process and you're going to do the best you can, then it's most likely that that will be approved by ADEQ. But for these large projects, again, we're applying for the permit, we're submitting the notice of intent, and then we're justifying these details in the SWIP document. They get to review that. And then they have 2 weeks to do so, and then they will respond. If we've done a good job, they're going to say, yeah, great job. Here's your notice of coverage or your authorization to discharge. So you can go ahead and start your project. All right, so here's another stopping point for any questions that have come through.
Okay, we have had one question come through. Are you only required to get a permit when it could possibly affect a waterway?
You are required to get the permit anytime, but it's based more on the fact that you're disturbing the ground and the size of the project. So if it's 1 acre or more and you're disturbing the ground, you are required to get that permit. So even if it's way out in the middle of nowhere and there's no waterway. There's still the potential for water to run downhill. It's going to go somewhere. It's going to end up in a water body eventually. So like we looked at that map, that ultimate receiving water for Bentonville is all the way down in the Fort Smith area. It doesn't even have to be close. It still can have an impact, and that's why you still have to have that permit.
Okay, that looks like that is everything.
All right, and I will make one comment because these are things that I've heard ADQ talk about. Subdivisions, if you have a lot of individual lots, like quarter-acre lots, and there are 50 of those, well, the overall development is more than 5 acres, obviously. So you've got quite a bit of area that's being managed. But each individual site or each individual lot is only a quarter of an acre. You're not excused from the permit. They consider the development as a whole. So you have to have the permit for something like that. All right. Now let's look at some of the additional details that go into the SWIP document. The SWIP is an implementation document, and I would argue that it's a book because a lot of stuff goes into this. And it's for the purpose of meeting the requirements of the construction general permit. It helps us make sure that we're doing all the things that need to be done to be in compliance, and it does contain a lot of documents. It is required for all sites. You have to have it on site, and it has to be readily available. Now, when I say it's required for all sites, you remember that notice of intent and submitting the SWIP to ADEQ was required for large sites. For small sites, you don't have to submit it in advance, but you still have to have the SWIP. So that's why when we talked about pretty much treat everything as a large site, this is why you still have to have that SWIP document. Now, our goal is that we're trying to remove 80% of total suspended solids from flows that exceed pre-development levels. That language is straight out of the permit. So really, we want it to be at least 80% as good as it is normally while we're doing our project. So it's not okay to make a big muddy mess of everything and clean it up after the project. We have to maintain this standard of 80% is usually a B in class, so we got to at least make a B on our sediment control during the project. If I don't do that, or if I don't do the things that the SWIP said I would do to try to manage all of this, then I can get a fine. Now, one of your documents that's in the handouts materials tab on the webinar controls, you can download the SWIP. This is a SWIP template that is on the ADEQ website. So this kind of outlines what all kind of stuff they're looking for. So we'll go through some of that. First, project name and location, parcel number, address, operator name. Some of it's the same as what's on the notice of intent, and that is so that it can be easily matched for review purposes. They do want to know the sequence of major activities that disturb soil. So let's say that you're going to replace a bridge. First of all, you're probably going to build some type of a temporary bridge to maintain traffic while you demolish and rebuild the main bridge. So that sequence of how you're going to move traffic, what major parts of construction are going to get done when, you're going to pour footings, you're going to place the superstructure. What are those major events that are going to happen? They want to know the total area, the disturbed area. And by the way, if you put those numbers in here and then need to change those later on, you do need to let ADEQ know about that. We talked about runoff coefficient. They want the level pre-construction as well as post-construction. So how is that going to change based on your construction project? And then they want a description of the soil or the quality of any discharge from the site. So right now, hopefully there's no discharge of sediment, but what type of soil do you have? And that's going to give them an indication of how likely are you to have serious erosion problems. Then we get down into the responsible parties section, and this is where if maybe you have a contractor that's doing some of the work for you. That contractor may also have a subcontractor. So everybody that's participating in the project needs to be aware of what these requirements are, what the SWIP says we're going to do, how we're going to sequence the events, what BMPs will go in place, who's going to do the maintenance. All that needs to be established up front. Then it goes on to talk about receiving waters and so on. This is one of your other handouts, and this is the SWIP document for small construction sites. These are not quite as involved, so fewer pages, smaller book, that kind of thing, but a lot of the same concepts are there. So just another version that you have available. Now again, the SWIP is required for all sites, whether it's large or small. The difference is large sites, you have to submit the SWIP prior to starting the project, and it has to be approved by ADEQ before you can start work. For small sites, we're just going to prepare it, put it together, and keep it on site. I don't have to get prior approval. I don't send it to ADEQ, but if something happens and someone calls in and says, hey, they're really making a mess over on this project, and they decide to come over, ADEQ pays you a visit, wants to inspect. When they get there, they expect to see that SWIP document. They will ask for it. If you don't have it, that's a violation of the permit because you're operating under the permit even though you did not file a notice of intent. So it's kind of the short track to get in and get things going, but you still have to follow all those same rules. Now, the purpose of the SWIP document is to make sure we comply with the permit. It gives us a way to document a plan, steps us through how are we going to identify these sources of pollution. It's going to describe what types of techniques and items that we're going to put in place to keep erosion and sediment from happening. Those are BMPs, and that's really the focus of the next webinar. It gives ADEQ a lot of information, but it also helps the designer. Because when you design the project and you think through all this stuff, it's hard to convey that to everyone who's going to be involved with the construction. So we have to communicate that by plans and documents and so on. And that's what the SWIP is. So it's helping the designer get that message out to those who are going to be doing the construction and inspection. But it also helps the ones doing the construction and inspection to do all of this management of stormwater without having to come up with it on their own. Years ago, it was one of those things where we know we had to pay attention to it, and a lot of times it was left up to the field personnel to figure out, how do I manage this? How do I prevent erosion? How do I control sediment? And so you had to come up with all this stuff. But the designers are the ones who are trained usually more specifically, and so now the field guys don't have to think of everything on their own. They have something to work from. So it's really a nice tool to have. You don't have to make this stuff up. You just have to inspect it, make sure that it's working. If it's not working, then you're going to come up with another plan. But you don't have to start from the ground up. Since it is the responsibility of the designer, the designer is obviously going to use the permit for guidance. And that SWIP special provision template that I've given you is a good way to get started. Make sure you don't miss something. But all of those details, drainage info, disturbance areas, at least a lot of that gets done before the project has started. Now, if you have a specific project contract, all of that is information about the project. That becomes part of the SWIP. So if you have a set of plans, that's part of your SWIP because it says what's happening with the project. It's not just the things that deal specifically with stormwater. It's really the whole thing. We got to have the big picture of what's happening within this project. Make sure your contractor and subs, they have to sign it, be aware of what else is going on. Think about things too, like hazardous materials handling. we're thinking about sediment, we're thinking about turbidity, oil and grease, that kind of stuff, but are there any hazardous materials that you will have on site for the project? If so, how are we going to handle that? We don't want sediment in the water, but we also don't want poisonous things in the water. So anything hazardous, think that through. And that might be just things that are used for some of the construction vehicles that are on site. Maybe that's totally on the contractor side of things, but we have to have a plan for how to handle that. Any approved state or local plans that might govern how some of this stuff is done, that is part of your SWIP. Any TMDL information, any of your other permits, your short-term activity authorization, all of those documents are part of your SWIP. The notice of coverage. You know, for a large site, we start with that notice of intent, we get the notice of coverage back. That is a document that goes along with this project. It becomes part of the SWIP. Your project plans. Hopefully you have, if they're very involved plans, you usually will have a page that shows some of your temporary erosion control items. It may give you some quantities. That's a great starting point. You're also going to need to update those for your as-built. What actually got put in place? When did those things get put in place? And so that's something that you're going to document and keep up with and edit week by week throughout the duration of the project. Same thing with inspection reports. Those are going to happen as you go through the project. Anything that's SWIP-related correspondence, any change orders that might change something in a roundabout way still will impact stormwater. That's got to be part of it. And a daily construction diary. This is good to do regardless of stormwater, but keep up with what's happening on the project. Sometimes you can backtrack and figure out, oh, this must have happened on the day that this happened. Who was on site? Who would know the answer to this question? Flip back through that construction diary. Just keep good records because it makes everything so much easier when there's a question. Now, at one time, ADEQ was not really a fan of electronic records because when they come to the site, they want to see all the parts of the SWIP on site for any type of inspection. So it was easier just to have the tangible papers. But now if someone is there who can pull this up on a computer, great, that's fine. Electronic files allow you a lot more flexibility, but the rule is when they show up, they have to see the whole SWIP. Anything that is part of your SWIP document has to be accessible at that time. So just make sure you're aware of that when you decide if you want printed papers or electronic. Things that have to go on your project plans. If you have any waters of the state, and this will be something, you know, it's the project site, so it'll be really close. If you have any of that, that needs to be marked on the plans. Maybe natural buffer boundary lines, floodplain boundaries, storm drain inlet location, that would be on the project site itself and anything in the immediate vicinity. Locations where stormwater is discharged to a water of the state or to an MS4. Where is that going? Show that location on the plans. And then you're also required to have a legend for all of your BMPs. So you would want a legend that indicates on this drawing what is silt fence, what is a rock ditch check, what is a sediment basin. So we'll look at that again Tuesday. Any project plan sheets, specifically, do you have certain items? Do you have any temporary erosion control details? So what I mean by that is, let's say your plan sheet shows that we're going to install silt fence from this point to that point. How are you going to install it? Do you have a detail showing how that silt fence is to be installed? How tall are the stakes? How tall is the fence? How far apart are the stakes placed? That kind of thing. What are the rules for how it's installed? And if there's anything specific to the maintenance of those items, that will be some of those standard things. And once you come up with all these documents, they kind of become a cookie cutter boilerplate section that you can plop into any SWIP document. So if you have some standard drawings, some typical language, keep that on hand and put it with every project that you do. And then think about the order of placement. based on the activities that you have for your project, is there a certain order that's going to work well for you? Okay? And some of that will actually be important. So here are some more of the pages of the SWIP document from the template itself. Site descriptions, responsible parties. Here's the page about the receiving waters. Where does sediment go? What section are you in? Where is that ultimate receiving water? Do you have any TMDL or 303D listed water bodies? Okay, how are you going to address that? And in the site description, all of these details. And it seems like, oh man, that's a lot of stuff to do. But I look at it from a designer standpoint of, oh good, if I check this list off and do all of these things, I know that I'm done. One of the hardest things about stormwater and designing for this is that it's not like a lot of the other things we do. We're doing an asphalt paving project, you figure a rate, you know the thickness of your pavement, you know the dimensions, everything's kind of an exact number. You run some tests and you get an answer and you compare that to a specification limit. Stormwater is not like that. Either it worked and you didn't have any sediment, or we got too much rainfall and what you thought would work didn't work and we got to try again. But there's no certainty to it. It just depends on how much rain you get. You could spend a whole bunch of money and put all these things in place and we could have a drought and there's no rain. None of your items really had to do their job. There's no way to know that in advance. But I also know that if you make the assumption the other way, Mother Nature will win. Mother Nature always wins. So doing all the things that need to be done and keeping up with the details is a big job, but it's very important, and it does actually help you know that you did the right things. Now, in terms of your pre-construction topographical map, show those estimated slopes and how they will change after construction. So in an area of your project, you might have a slope, and when you do this project, you're going to kind of flatten that area out. That's information that we need. Or maybe you're going to cut into a slope and actually make it steeper. That's information that you need. So directions of stormwater flow. And then I've got a note here for areas of disturbance and undisturbed areas. The less you can disturb on a project, the less impact that erosion will have, because it's not going to erode as easily. So if you can show areas that are not going to be disturbed, that's huge. That's a big deal. So that's a good thing to show. ADEQ does like to see things like that. Where are the locations of major controls? Where are you going to put your construction exits? Where are you going to put concrete washout areas? What about offsite materials, your waste, your borrow areas, equipment storage, any water bodies, floodplain boundaries we've already mentioned, stormwater discharge, and this is something that's going to change. Maybe from your project site, when you start, water might leave the site over here. But as you move, you disturb the ground, you move the dirt, you're changing, whereas downhill, later on, you might have stormwater leaving at a different location. So that is something that will be continuously updated. And then again, you have to have that legend, and you also need to show those storm drain inlets. Now, controls during construction. We're trying to stabilize the site. We're trying to keep sediment from leaving the site. So we're going to look at erosion and sediment controls. I need to have an idea of those construction activities, the general timeline. How am I going to stabilize? You know, can I do work in this little area and get it finished and then stabilize that area where I don't have to worry about erosion right there? I can go and focus on another area of the project. So will I have seeding in certain areas? What sediment basin, silt fence, diversion ditches, all of these different BMPs or best management practices. Okay. And then where are you going to put your waste? Where do you put the debris? How are you handling? We mentioned hazardous materials already. Sanitary facilities. Where do your blue rooms go? And then off-site vehicle tracking. How are you going to keep that from impacting public roadways? and concrete waste. Where do you put it? So in choosing those, we need to know the site. So knowing everything we can know, it's, from a design standpoint, if you look at state level projects, designers are in Little Rock. Projects are not all in Little Rock. So a lot of times design happens without the designer actually setting foot on the property. If you're in a local agency, I think you've got a much better chance of having folks in your working group that maybe know that area. And if you've got a field personnel person or somebody that works there that says, hey, I live out here, and when it rains, this spot's always a problem. This always washes out. That ditch overflows. Knowing those kind of things in advance, that's great. So if you don't have someone who can tell you, these are some of the questions that you can ask to try to get a better feel for what that situation is going to look like during a rainstorm, and then choosing the controls that will fit. Okay, pick controls that are going to work. How do we know they're going to work? Truthfully, we don't, but the more we learn about them, the better job we can do to fit them to the right situation. Will it fit in the location? Do I have enough space? Is it durable enough for the length of time it needs to last? Can I afford it? And when you think about the cost of those materials, is it just materials, or do I need to consider the cost of installation and maintenance? If it's kind of an intricate thing, it may be expensive to install. If it blows out and I need to replace it, can I get it when I need it? Is it available? Is it easy to maintain? Is it difficult? Is it compatible? Are there any safety issues that I'm going to create by implementing this thing? If you put something up and it somehow blocks visibility, that could be an issue. Is it practical? Does it fit the sequence of events? And then are there any state or local regulations that say you must use this or you're not allowed to use that? Think through all those questions and pick the controls that fit the situation. Now, after construction is completed, we've done all of this stuff. We've updated our SWIP document, done our inspections, and so on. We're going to put permanent controls in place. Everything that I do during construction really is just temporary. Once I get it all stable, everything is kind of permanent in place, it should function on its own without anyone having to go out and look and say, hey, do we have erosion? We shouldn't. We should have a permanent control there that prevents all of the erosion. So those permanent controls will be things like channel linings, culverts, riprap, sodding, ditch paving, but they're long term. All of those need to have the goal of spreading out the water and slowing it down. So you might have some concrete spillways, or your ditch paving with those dissipators that are in there. Wetland infiltration, anything you can do to continue to spread out the water and slow it down long term, that's going to help you. And then, of course, finally, the endangered species. Those are all documents that were done early on. If anything changes throughout the project, update those forms. Add that to the SWIP, put that revision in there. Also, keep up with employee training. Y'all are doing training right now. You'll get a certificate next week. That's something to include in your SWIP, that your employees have had some training and knowledge of what they're doing. Pay attention to maintenance. Document the maintenance that's done on the controls. If you document how much maintenance you have to do, you might get a better feel for which BMPs really work better for you. What can you put in place and it just works versus something that maybe is cheaper, but you're having to continually maintain it. And then inspections. Inspection reports will get added periodically. So we go through the whole project, get all those permanent controls in place, and we're finished. We're ready to say, hands off, everything is stable. Now I'm going to let ADEQ know that I'm finished, and they may come out and do a final inspection. But the other thing I do want to point out here is the notice of coverage. You know, we talked about the notice of intent. ADEQ gives us permission to do the project. But for a small site, we did not submit a notice of intent. All we did was submit nothing. We put our SWIP together, But I have to have a notice of coverage posted at the job site. For a large site, a large job, a lot of times you'll have that big board with all of your construction notices and all of the paperwork and notices for employees, visitors, what have you. One of those pages needs to be your notice of coverage or authorization to discharge. That has to be in place and it has to be readable at all times. If it's not, somebody shows up for an inspection, can't get a hold of anybody on the job, that's an automatic ding on your inspection. But if you're a small site, you never turned anything in, they're not going to send anything back. So you're going to go to the website and you're going to print this page off, and this shows that you have automatic coverage because you are a small job site, less than 5 acres. You fill this out, post it, and that is your notice of coverage. So that one you kind of do on your own. All right, we are to a questions slide. So Tally, do we have any questions that have come through?
Yes, we did have, looks like one came through a few minutes ago. And that question is, can multiple SWIPs and permits exist on the same property at the same time? For example, a subdivision and an individual residential lot?
That is a great question. That's a little bit complicated. I did mention how a subdivision has like the overall development, which is the job site itself, and the permit is required for that. The individual lots can't be considered separate to get out of having to operate under the permit. The other piece of that is that once, like the developer gets the land and then they partition, they draw up the subdivision, when construction starts happening, it doesn't all happen at the same time. I guess maybe that's not true. In Northwest Arkansas, things tend to get built and sold and occupied very quickly. But let's say we had a subdivision where over time, a few lots sold, folks bought that, built houses, or maybe a contractor built a few houses on some of the lots. So they own those spaces. The overall development is the one that holds the permit. You can't just say, hey, well, this lot sold, I'm no longer responsible. There has to be a responsible party, and it does get a little tricky, but until most of the lots are built out and everything is stabilized, the developer still holds the responsibility. Typically, a house buyer is not going to go out and get put a SWIP together and get a permit or do any of that kind of thing. But let's say that the developer then sold all of the lots to a contractor. They would need to work out the fact that the contractor's got to get their own permit. I'm not sure that you can actually transfer a permit to someone else. They would have to apply for their own permit, but then that one, the original one, could be null and void once the contractor takes over, the house contractor takes over and owns it. But somebody has to maintain that until everything is kind of permanently set up and done. Now, if it's just one house here or there on small lots, you may get to a situation where you no longer are considered a job site that requires a permit, but that is a little bit tricky. There is a misconception that once the developer sells off however much, they wash their hands of it. They are technically still the owner operator that handles the permit. So they still need to be doing the inspections. And if they want to transfer that responsibility, they have to work with the contractor and officially make that happen. And then ADEQ would need to be notified that this is now the responsible party. The original developer is no longer having a part of that. So good question, and one that does need to be addressed, but can be a little tricky. Most of the time, nobody really wants to be responsible for that stuff. So hopefully that answered that. Anything else?
I believe that is everything at the moment.
All right, good deal. All right, we'll do this last section and talk about inspections here. Now, inspections have to be done throughout the process. And you have two choices. ADEQ will allow you to do one inspection every 7 days, or you can do an inspection once every 14 days, but then you're also required to do an additional inspection anytime there's a quarter inch or more rainfall event. So choose whichever one. RDOT uses the 7-day sequence, so it might be that you're doing inspections every 7 days, but it's nice because you don't have to worry about how much rainfall. The other option is kind of hedge your bets on which one you think would be more beneficial for your situation. But when you do an inspection, you're checking all of the things. You're looking for places that water is leaving your job site. You're looking for signs of potential sediment leaving your job site, and looking at all your BMPs. Are they in good shape? Are they performing? Do they look like they're still in good repair? Do they need to be maintained? And you're noting all of these things that might need to be done. Once you identify those, you have 3 business days to get them taken care of. So it's not something that you can say, well, I don't see any rain in the forecast for a week or 2, so I'm going to hold off on that. As soon as you identify that it's an issue, it has been discovered, and you have 3 business days to get it fixed. When you fix something, you're going to note that in the plans that such and such was repaired or additional silk fence was placed here. Keep a log of all the things that were done. Update those plans within 7 days. Document the repairs and record dates of major work activities areas. So say you had a 2-mile stretch of roadway that you're working on, and you're on the north end, and you work there for a few weeks, and then you move to the south end, say. Make sure you keep up with when you moved away from one area, because there are some rules we'll talk about next time on how long you can be away from an area and not be actively working or leaving it disturbed. Inspections do need to include rainfall data. We need to know when it happened, how much rainfall there was. You need to document any discharge from the job site. Where was it, and was there any sediment in it? Document all those major construction activities with dates, and then looking at the BMPs. Are they working? Number 1. Number 2, are they in need of maintenance? Are they still in good repair? Were they installed properly? Sometimes a subcontractor comes in and they put everything out there, and most of the time it's pretty good, maybe sometimes not so much. But if it wasn't installed correctly, it's not going to work, and that's going to create future problems. The hardest part is to look at your job site and say, where do I need a BMP, but I don't have one? It's easy to look at the ones that are there and see how they're performing. It's much harder to see something that's not there that should be. And also, it's kind of a personal opinion. So if you get an inspection, say from ADEQ, and you thought through this, and this is what I think needs to be there, this should work, ADEQ comes and looks and says, no, I think you need that. It's very hard to back that up with any factual, numerical type of evidence. Sometimes it really is just personal preference, or who has experience in this area, or I've seen this happen and I think you need to add this. So sometimes you may identify something and it's different from what the ADEQ inspector might see. So looking for those additional locations where something needs to be done, that's tricky. Now, this is the ADEQ version of an inspection form. It tells the inspector's name, title, the date, and it does ask for how many days since the last rainfall event and how much rainfall has happened since the last rainfall event that you documented. Descriptions of discharges, locations of the discharge of sediment, locations in need of additional BMPs, and that is the hard one. So you can fill this out, and there's kind of a lot of white space. RDOT uses their own inspection form, and that has been specifically approved by ADEQ, and it lists all of the types of BMPs that are typically included on an RDOT project with what to look for, specifics. If you develop something like that, that's great, but you're only allowed to use your own form if ADEQ has approved it. So most people just use the one that they've provided on the website. So those are the inspections that you do in-house. There are also inspections by other people who come in. Most commonly it will be ADEQ, and most often these are because someone has complained. They've seen mud, or maybe water's running into their backyard, or mud's running onto their driveway, or who knows, but it's usually something that they don't like. Sometimes it's because mud has been tracked out onto the roadway. They drove by right after they washed their car and it slung mud on their car, and they don't like that. So they knew to call ADEQ. Now ADEQ is knocking on the door saying, hey, we need to inspect your job site, and they're going to look and see what's going on. Some of the more common problems are that the construction site notice is not posted. That's that notice of coverage. It has to be present. It has to be readable. It has to be there all the time. And really the whole point is that if someone shows up for an inspection and no one is there on the job to greet them, they have a contact name and phone number to get a hold of someone. If they can't read it, you will get dinged. If they can't find it, you will get dinged on that. Other common problems are the entire SWIP not being on site. Make sure all those documents stay together. If it means printing out a copy of things that exist in other places, but having a copy to stay right there at the job site, do that. You've probably seen job sites, or maybe you use the big mailbox that you put, it's got SWIP or ADEQ printed on the outside, and that's where all those documents are kept. If it's a large job and you've got a field trailer, maybe it's kept inside that field office, but it's got to be on site so that if someone comes up to inspect, everything is right there. A lot of times folks will get behind on the inspections, and it may be that they did the inspection, they just didn't document it even, and that will get you in trouble. Some other violations, off-site vehicle tracking is a big one because it's very visible to the public. If they see any evidence that you're not protecting water bodies, that really is the whole goal of all of this stuff that we're doing. So that's a pretty big violation. They will get you on improperly installed or missing BMPs. And poor housekeeping. Poor housekeeping really is just a first impression sort of a thing. If your job site looks messy, it may give the impression that there are probably some other issues to look for, and it might generate a more thorough inspection. So having a nice clean job site is good. You can also have inspections from your MS4, that's your municipal separate storm sewer system. And this is really more about coordination than anything else. And MS4 has a responsibility that, say for an urban area that maintains the storm sewer system, they need to know what's going into their system. And if you have a project that's going to impact that, they have some responsibilities to ADEQ, and they're kind of the middleman. So a lot of times they will do inspections of projects in that city or that area, and then they will have some things that they require you to do because ADEQ is requiring it of them. So they are required usually to do monthly inspections on active construction sites. So if that does impact you, make sure you have good communication with those folks. They also have the authority to oversee the construction site program. So they do get involved for sure. And again, just good housekeeping. You can see the picture on the left, not so good. Picture on the right looks nice and clean. If you want someone to have a good first impression, make sure that your job site looks nice. And then the very end, again, is that notice of termination. Everything's done. We're telling ADEQ, construction finished. We've stabilized everything. I'm not going to disturb the ground anymore. I don't have any stormwater discharges that are carrying sediment. I don't have any more temporary controls in place. Those have all been removed. Then I'm going to do a final inspection. I'm going to take photos, and that will kind of wrap up all of the paperwork that I need to do. ADEQ may then decide to come out and do an inspection as well. They may not. They may be happy with the photos that you took and submitted, but you do have to retain your records for at least 3 years. So if those are digital files, make sure you can access those files for at least 3 years. If it's papers that you put in a box, make sure you know where they went. And this is what that notice of termination used to look like. Again, this is superseded by an online form, but this looks like the beginning section of the NOI. So again, we can match up documents to see which project that goes with and be able to check that off the list. All right, any last minute questions?
All right, looks like we just have one more that came through, and that is, do you have to have a rain gauge on the job?
Aha. A rain gauge is a very good idea to have on the job because you do have that part of the inspection that asks how many inches of rainfall since your last inspection. So they do want to know what are your rainfall totals for a given period of time. You don't have to have a rain gauge. Some folks will use like a weather website, that keeps all that information. But most of the time, we have a lot of variety in how much rainfall you get. So what falls on your job site may not really be reflected by what you're finding online. That's more of a general overall area. So it's a good idea to have it, but it's not a formal requirement.
Okay, great. Well, I believe that is everything that we have questions-wise.
All right, very good. Well, I have a few questions for a knowledge check, so I'm going to post these as poll questions. I'm going to launch the first one now. What document must be posted at the job site at all times? Do you remember which one that is? It could be the notice of intent, notice of coverage, notice of termination, or the SWIP. I'm going to give you a couple more seconds on that one. All right, very good. That one is the notice of coverage. That's the one that has to be posted. Now, some of you did pick SWIP, and you have to have the SWIP accessible to an inspector, but that might be locked up in a field office or something. So when you have someone that greets your inspector, they have the ability to get to it. Or maybe it's electronic files that you can get to on your computer to show them. So you do have to have the SWIP on site at all times, but it doesn't have to be accessible to everyone. The notice of coverage does have to be accessible for someone entering your job site. Very good. All right, the next one. Which document must be prepared for all permitted sites, regardless of size? Notice of intent, notice of coverage, notice of termination, or SWIP. Which document must be prepared for all permitted sites, regardless of size? All right, I'll give you a couple more seconds on that one. I'm going to close that one. Okay, the document that has to be prepared is the SWIP. That's the one that you're going to prepare regardless of the site. The notice of intent was the other possible choice that you might have thought. The notice of intent only gets submitted for large sites. If you submit it, ADEQ approves it, they send back a notice of coverage. If you were a small site and you never submitted the NOI, you're going to go get your own notice of coverage from their website and post that. But if you're a small site, you're not actually submitting a notice of intent, but you are going to prepare the SWIP document. All right, the next question is, a 404 permit is required for work in what? Commercial areas, farm reservoirs, the immediate vicinity of a water body, or an MS4. 404 permit. 5 more seconds on that. All right, I'm going to close that one. The 404 permit is required for work in or in the immediate vicinity of a water body. That's the one that goes through the Corps of Engineers because you are potentially directly impacting that water body. So it requires some additional permits. All right, and then the last one, I expect everyone to get this one. Water runs uphill, downhill, sideways, or diagonally. Very good. All right, of course, that one is water runs downhill. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end that poll. And you should see our closing slide here with contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to email at arltap@uark.edu, and that will get to me, and I can answer whatever questions you have. When you close out of the webinar, there will be an evaluation form, and I'd be interested in any feedback that you have. So get that back, and assuming there's no other questions. So if not, we will close for today. Thank you so much for attending, and hope to catch you next Tuesday afternoon. We'll talk about best management practices for stormwater in construction situations. See you then.